Hi, my name is Andre Cohen, and I just want to welcome you to this particular training on implicit bias. Now, I know for many of you, this idea or the concept of implicit bias or even having diversity conversations can sometimes seem uncomfortable. You may have some thoughts that you don't think are necessarily popular with other folks. And what I'd like to suggest is that in this particular presentation, I'm only going to ask you to do one thing, and that is to be a critical thinker. What does it mean to be a critical thinker? Well, simply, I want you to take the information that we offer, see what makes sense for you, weigh it with other pieces of information that you're getting in your environment, in your workplace, and in your world, and see what it is that you can actually make actionable in your own life. And so I'm not asking you to believe everything that I'm offering or to accept it as general rule or way of living, but I would like for you to be a critical thinker as we engage in this process. So what is implicit bias? Before we start to unravel all of those things, let's first just talk about this idea of bias. I would submit to you that we all have bias because we all come from a context. And when I say we all come from a context, what I mean is geographically, temporally, the time that we grew up in is very different. And each of us responds to those things in very different ways. And so those become the center points of our bias. And so bias is simply the mental direction that you lean towards or against a particular thing, concept, or in this particular case, person. And so when we talk about this idea of bias, I want to let you know that it's not necessarily a bad thing. There are certain biases that can actually bear fruit. For example, I'm walking down the street and there's 6 guys coming towards me. It's 11:30 at night. I have a bias of what that situation presents for me. And so given that I'm walking down the street and I'm by myself, these 6 guys are coming towards me, it's late at night, what decision do you think I might make? Yeah, I cross the street. Why? Because I have a bias towards this situation. I judge this particular situation as potentially dangerous, and so I'm looking for ways to be safe. So bias sets us up for some pitfalls as well as a launching point. As we talk more about this idea of bias, I want to just hand this to you, that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And so, for example, rain. Is it good or is it bad? Snow. Is it good or is it bad? And I would suggest to you that whatever your bias is dictates how you'll behave given that particular situation. And so here in Minnesota, we know that we have quite a bit of snow. And so you can either get with the program and go ice fishing and hang out in this weather, or you can be a shut-in for a greater part of 6 months of the year. Snow is not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. But it is that bias that you have that really determines how you will interact with the world. And so we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. So bias in and of itself is not a bad thing. But when we try to apply those principles from our limited context to people, particularly people that we don't know, that's when we start to have some difficulties in our workplace and in our environment. Now, we just talked a little bit about bias, so now let's talk about this implicit part. So what exactly does it mean to be implicit? Let's flip that. Let's talk about explicit bias. Now, explicit bias is pretty in your face. I mean, the whole idea of implicit bias is that it's easy to define, and we know when people are sort of out of pocket. Examples of people who exhibited explicit bias would be folks like Michael Scott from The Office or Archie Bunker from All in the Family, America's favorite bigot. Now, the interesting thing about the All in the Family show and the character Archie Bunker was that it brought together 2 groups of people simultaneously for 2 different reasons. People loved Archie. He spoke his mind. He gave it to the people the way people really felt. And then other people saw Archie as a caricature, an archetype of a long past bygone period. And so those 2 groups of people were able to watch this explicit bias performed on national television. And so explicit bias are those jokes, those comments, those off-color or inappropriate things that we might not necessarily say to our loved ones in a public forum, but that we reserve for those kind of private moments. And we know that they are crouched in things that are often not known to be PC or politically correct. And we have mechanisms to deal with those explicit biases. Implicit bias is quite the opposite, and it takes a bit more concentration and thoughtfulness to actually grab a hold to this concept of implicit bias. So before, we talked about coming from a context, and the context that I come from has shaped my worldview and my paradigm, how I see the world in a particular way, which also means that there are pieces of the world and pieces of even my own understanding that I may not necessarily be aware of, because those fall into the areas that I might call blind spots. So implicit bias are oftentimes blind spots that I'm not aware of. Unawareness that can actually cause me problems, particularly when I try to apply those concepts to human beings. So how might implicit bias have negative effects? Let me paint you a picture. Two individuals walk into a department store at exactly the same time. One of those individuals gets followed throughout their visit to the store. So much so that they get frustrated and they leave without purchasing anything. That second individual is able to roam freely in the store without having store security or anyone follow them. And actually the requests for help are pretty genuine in their encounters. That person also, too, leaves the store without purchasing anything. They actually left with more than what they came with. Now, if I were to ask you to describe these two individuals, what words, what thoughts, what concepts come to mind when you hear that story, given the context that I created for you? That, my friend, is implicit bias.